Hi, this is Scott Shepard, photo media instructor at Lake Area Technical Institute, Watertown, South Dakota, and this is a tutorial that will show you how to use Photoshop CS5 to make an HDR photo. And HDR photography is really kind of a rage right now, and it stands for High Dynamic Range. Now, as you look at this photo, you're going to notice that it's a little bit unreal, and that's one of the processes that can be the result of HDR photography. In this particular case, I took two photos and combined them, and then used a few tweaks in Photoshop to make a photo that looks like this. Now here's the thing, the human eye can look at a scene like this, which was shot about a half an hour after sunrise yesterday morning by a place called Lonesome Lake north of Watertown. And the human eye can look at this and it can see the clouds and the bright and the dark parts of the sky, and can also look at the foreground and see that as normal as well. The human eye has a high dynamic range, but cameras don't. So as a photographer, if I exposed for the foreground, this is what I get, but you'll notice that the sky is overexposed. And so if I expose for the clouds, which were just absolutely beautiful yesterday morning, the foreground is totally underexposed. And so what the software, Photoshop CS5, does is it takes these two photos and combines them into something like that. Pretty cool. Now, I want to talk a little bit about composition in this photo to begin with. First of all, I realize that the horizon line is right across the middle of the picture, and that tends to violate the rule of thirds here. But it's not the horizon eye that really draws the eye in this picture. And like any good landscape photo, I try to get something that's interesting in the foreground, which happens to be that rock. Compositionally, that's a pretty important part of this photo, the way I set it up. And then the middle ground, which is this area of tall grass that has been crushed down over the course of the summer. I love this because it gives lots of texture to the foreground of the picture. And of course the middle ground also includes the lake, which is only a sliver of blue here, and then the sky, which provides plenty for the eye to look at. So there's a lot going on in this picture. So the goal is to try to make it as interesting as possible. The other thing that's important about HDR photography is this. You need to make sure that you set up on a tripod. If you know how to do auto exposure bracketing, that's a cool way to get three photos. In this case, I did take three, although I'm only going to end up using one that's one stop underexposed. If you look at the bottom here, if you look at the bottom, you see one EV. That means it's one stop overexposed. And if you look at this one, it's that's one stop overexposed, and that's one stop underexposed. Now, the other thing that's important about HDR photography is that you use aperture priority. So I set the f-stop to 8, and so the camera's going to change the shutter speed. Now, the reason I do that is that I don't want varying depths of field on the two photos or the three photos that I'm going to combine. I'll let the camera make the judgment about shutter speed. And then one final thing to be concerned about is that there's a lot of motion in the picture. It's really going to be hard to combine two pictures. In this case, the only real motion were the clouds, and if you snap the photos quickly enough, the clouds aren't going to move that much, even though the software will try to find where things overlap if they've been moving. I'm showing you this in Aperture, although Aperture is not the tool that I used. I took these two photos and I exported them using Aperture, and I exported the masters. Now, one thing about the masters is that they're fairly bland, and that's because they're raw files. Having exported them, I'm going to next go to Photoshop, and I'm going to go to File, Automate, and way down at the bottom, now I have quite a few other things in my Automate menu that you may not have because I bought some third-party plugins. But we'll go down to Merge to Hdr Pro. And I get a dialog that says Merge to Hdr Pro. Choose two or more files from a set of exposures to merge. Now I'm sticking with two because I think I have exactly what I need in those two photos. One that's a stop overexposed, one that's a stop underexposed. So I'll click Browse, I actually have a folder called Lonesome Lake, and in particular I'm going to take file 507 and 508, which are camera raw. This is a Canon 5D that I'm using, by the way, and these are very large files. And this is very processor intensive, incidentally, so I would encourage you to shut down any other applications that you have running in the background if you don't need them. Now, the two that I have open are Aperture and Photoshop. And even with everything else closed, this is going to take some time. In fact, I'm going to use editing in the screencast software to save some time. So I click OK. So after a minute or so, I get something that looks like this, which is still not the photo that you saw at the beginning of this tutorial, the photo that I'm using for the desktop. So notice over here in this merged Hdr Pro dialog that is open, or window that's open, I have something called Preset Custom. And there are several up here that you can play with. If you take more saturated, you'll notice that. And in fact, that's the one that I used. You can even adjust these things a little bit. So let's take more saturated, and then let's play a little bit with exposure, because I think this looks a little bit too dark. We have to be very careful here because we don't want to blow out the highlights in the sky like that. Somewhere in there. I can also just affect the dark parts of the picture like that, and actually I'm trying to make the foreground look a little bit better. And I can actually make the sky brighter or darker based on the highlight slider. And there's something called edge glow here, and this is where you can kind of make things more or less real depending on how you adjust this. Now, I noticed that when I slid the strength slider that it tended to affect the low-lying clouds at the horizon, and I like those details. And we'll do something like that. I can also adjust saturation. I could actually desaturate this picture like that if I wanted to. This is actually highly saturated, which makes it a little bit surreal. I can affect the vibrance just like that. And I am satisfied with this, but you could play around a lot with this. And if you find something that you like and you want to try to reproduce, then you can actually click here and save this as a preset. I actually have one called Shepherd 1 as a preset. And it's what I used earlier this morning when I practiced this. And actually I'm going to stick with that Shepherd preset. It's all of these things adjusted and then saved. And so I'll click OK. And this is processor intensive as well, so I may cut a little bit of this out. And there you have the final product. This is a brand new file that it's created. It's a flattened file, and it's a 16-bit Photoshop file. And so all I need to do is save this, probably give it a title. I could crop it and use it as a desktop, which is what I did for this. And there you have it. One of the things that's interesting about HDR photography is that very often you'll get something different from one attempt to the next. But just to summarize, what you need to have is a tripod, your camera set to aperture priority, and a subject that isn't moving a whole lot, and an understanding of how to intentionally overexpose and underexpose a photo. Auto exposure bracketing is probably the easiest way to do that. And if you don't know how to do that, do a search online or ask your loyal photography instructor, and he or she, I'm sure, will teach you how to do that. Thanks for listening.